Hi, I'm Lynette and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be sharing with you if I only had 10 eyeshadow palettes, if I could only keep 10 palettes, which ones would they be? And I saw this on Annette's Makeup Corner, and then I thought, oh, you know what? I think I might try to do this. And surprisingly enough, 3 came to mind very quickly, like right off the top of my head. I thought of 3, and then shit got difficult. So these are not in any particular order, and these are not my favorite eyeshadow palettes of all time. They are palettes that either I would totally miss if I didn't have them to reach for. Out of the 10 palettes that I only had, I would really miss these if they weren't in that stash of palettes, or that they would help me to build a foundation on which I would start to perhaps build my collection again, if that was an option. So hopefully this will make a little more sense as we go along. So let me start off with the very first palette that I thought of when I decided to do this. If I only had 10 palettes, this is the palette that I thought of first, and it is by Ace Beaute. This isn't going to surprise those of you that follow me here. And it's the Oceanic palette. And this is, I mean, fairly recent in that I got it in this year, but you've seen it on my channel now a few times. I've done I think I've done 2 tutorials with it, and I think I may have done a look with it off camera as well. And yeah, this is definitely one of my favorites. And the reason why, right? It has all the greens really, shimmer or matte, and all the blues I think that anybody would really need, or at least you'd have most of them if you only had 10 palettes. And the formula, of course, I love the Ace Beaute formula. The mattes are super pigmented, and the shimmers are nice too. These shimmers are not Juvia's Place type quality shimmers, but they're nice as well. And just look at that pigmentation, like, woo! And a green that actually, like a neon green that actually shows up on my skin. So yeah, this palette definitely, if I only had 10, this is the one that would at least start me off, or at least give me options in terms of blue and green eyeshadows. I think I'm going to be going through a lot of makeup wipes in this video. Okay, so the next one that immediately came to mind was also an Ace Beaute palette. I promise this whole video isn't going to be Ace Beaute palettes. And it is of no surprise to you that follow me here either. It is the Paradise Fallen palette. And of all the 4 in the Paradise collection, this one is my favorite. And as you can see, you could probably see why. It's a beautiful purple palette. It's a dark, like grungy purple palette. So I'd have my purples, right? And then I'd also have my gray tone eyeshadows and my black. And even though I don't use gray shadows that much, I still want to have them. Like, I still want to be able to have them available to me in my eyeshadow collection. And I'm going to show you some swatches of this one too. Like, again, uber pigmented purple. I mean, if you like purple, that's it. Like, this is the palette people thought the ABH Norvina palette should have been. This is purple. So yeah, so this was a no-brainer. This is probably, aside from the Oceanic palette, this is my most used palette this year as well. Okay, and the third palette that immediately came to mind when I thought of only 10 palettes that I could have, and that's from Juvia's Place, and it is my favorite Juvia's Place palette, and it is the Tribe palette. And this is a beautiful, this remains, I think, in my opinion, the most unique palette in my collection. It's certainly the most unique Juvia's Place palette that I own. And it is a beautiful green palette. It's predominantly green. You do have your orange shade here, and you do have a couple of neutrals. Actually, this is like a dirty mustard brown shade, so it's mustard green brown shade, so it's got a little green in it. And then you've got your bronzy, you know, neutral shades. This shade right here, Coral, it's this champagne green shade. Another green, light green eyeshadow that shows up on my skin tone. And yeah, this palette, you know, if I want it for green, if I want it for a different type green, this would be the palette that I could also go to. I did one of my most favorite looks with this palette. So yeah, this one was definitely a no-brainer. This shade right here is just everything. Okay, after those three palettes, then I really started to have to give this some thought. And we're gonna stay with Juvia's Place. After much deliberation, I came up with a couple of more Juvia's Place palettes. So number 4 on this list would be the Nubian palette. And this one is my most used Juvia's Place palette because it is a neutral palette. And I remember when I first bought this palette, I couldn't stop myself from using it. And this is back in the day when I was just getting into eyeshadow application and doing looks. So I wasn't as comfortable with bright, bold colors as I am now. And so I was doing a lot of neutral looks, and this palette, as you can see, it's pretty banged up. But yeah, there was a time when I had to like tell myself, listen, you can't use that palette again today. You got to use something else. And it has pretty much all your neutral shades. This one I'm not crazy about, the dark brown. These shadows don't have any names. I mean, you know, it's okay. It's just, I don't know, I'm not crazy about it. But it's got great transition shades. This is a pretty yellow. This is a great transition shade here. A nice beige. And then it's got some really nice shimmer shadows. This dual chrome right here. So this really, I mean, when it comes to neutral eyeshadows, this really, for darker skin tones, this for me really has just about everything that I need in order to do a neutral look. So yeah, this palette, it's an oldie but a goodie. I don't use it very often anymore because I have so many, and I'm just all about the bold colors now that I'm into and more comfortable doing eyeshadows and seeing myself in bold color. But yeah, this palette, if I only had 10 palettes to choose from, this would definitely have to be one of them because it would have my neutrals pretty much covered. Sticking with Juvia's Place one more time, palette number 5 in the 10 palette collection would have to include the Masquerade palette. This is another oldie but goodie, a classic. They do have the Masquerade mini, but I bought this before they came out with the mini. And the reason why this palette would have to be one of my 10 is for these 2 rows right here, these 2 top rows of color right here. I barely ever touch these shadows when I use this palette. But for a while, this was my go-to palette when it came to shimmery, colorful shadows on my lid. It was often when I would use another palette and maybe I would use a shimmery purple and that purple just wasn't doing the trick for me, and I would pull out this palette because I knew that this one was not going to do me wrong. And you cannot go wrong with the Juvia's Place shimmers. I mean, their metallic formula is one of the best out there, if not arguably the best. So yeah, again, another palette that I don't use a lot these days, only because I buy so many. I've bought so many since then, and you know, this one kind of gets forgotten about. But if, let's say I had to start over, or if I only had 10 right now starting from today, this palette would definitely have to be one of the 10. The next palette, I really had to dig through the archives. This challenge really made me think. It really made me go through my whole collection to think about, if I only had 10 eyeshadow palettes, which are the ones that I would want to start using immediately, which ones would be a good basis or a good foundation for which to build on my eyeshadow collection. And so this one is a real oldie but a goodie, and it's from Lorac, and it is the Unzipped palette. And yeah, I haven't used this palette in a long time, but as you can see, at one point it was really like my go-to palette. Again, early in my makeup journey and my eyeshadow application journey, and when I was doing a lot of neutral looks, this is another palette that I would really have to force myself not to use, and you know, because I needed to use other palettes because of this one I would go to all of the time. And again, in terms of neutral shadows, I feel like for darker skinned women like myself, these have a lot of really nice transition shades, and it's a really nice cool tone palette, and you don't see a lot of cool tone neutral palettes. I think now, definitely more recently, we're seeing a few more, but back when I bought this palette, you didn't see a whole lot of that. And so I think that's another reason why this palette was such a standout palette for me for so long. And the Lorac eyeshadow formula, I mean, it is so, they're so soft, they're so buttery, the shimmers are so beautiful, wet or dry. Like, this is a really beautiful palette, and I'm glad that I've pulled it out. I actually have used it more recently. I either used it this year or just last year, but it is one that I have more recently pulled out of my drawer and actually used again, because again, I think it's a really timeless palette. It's an everyday palette for those folks who don't want a lot of color, who don't want too much boldness going on the eyes. It's more like an everyday work palette. Like, it's very versatile, very versatile, and the formula is really, really excellent. So yeah, I had to pull that one out of the archives, but I didn't forget about it. All right, and now we're gonna go away from neutrals for a moment, and we're gonna get back into color and more bright colors. And this is a palette that I don't know that you've ever, maybe you've seen me use it once or twice in a tutorial where I use just one shadow in a look. But if I only had 10 palettes, of course I have to have something that's got some bright colorful shades in it, some bright matte colorful shades in it. And for that, it would have to be the Viseart Editorial Brights palette, and this is what she looks like. And Viseart really, I think they make one of the best, if not the best, matte eyeshadow formula. Very expensive, yes, but the quality is excellent. I still remember the first time I ever used this palette. I think I've had it now for a year or two, and I was amazed. I was blown away actually by how pigmented these shadows were. And this is not my first Viseart matte eyeshadow palette. I do have the dark mattes palette, but this is I think this was probably the first one that had bright matte shades in it that really stayed true to color when I placed them on my lid and blended them out, and were just as bright and vibrant on my skin as they are in the pan. This red shade right here, woo, blew me away. Absolutely blew me away the first time I ever used it. And yeah, so if I only had 10 eyeshadow palettes, I would have to have a colorful palette, and if it was going to be a colorful palette, then it would have to be, one of them at least would have to be the Viseart Editorial Brights palette, because this palette is freaking amazing. Okay, on to number 7. We only have 3 more to go, and these palettes are more recent additions to my collection. And now that I have them, I can't imagine being without them because they have really helped to round out my collection. So one of them is from Colourpop, and it's one of their monochromatic palettes, the most recent one that I've purchased, and it is the Main Squeeze palette. Now I have several of their monochromatic palettes, but this one here is the monochromatic red palette. And after using it for the first time just like a couple weeks ago, it was very clear to me that this was a palette I would need to have in my collection. I don't have a lot of reds. I mean, I do have red shadows, of course. I don't have a bunch of reds. And this one is just a palette full of red or red family shadows, and this one right here is my favorite. It's this like satin red. It's just gorgeous. It's absolutely gorgeous. You can easily make a full red look with this palette. I did do a tutorial in which I showed you a red look with this palette, or you can use it along with other palettes when you want a punch of red. And it's really, Colourpop's eyeshadow formula is one of the best, and not just in indie brands, but just on the market, in my opinion. And so yeah, this one was a pretty easy one to pick once I started thinking about, you know, what would be missed in my collection, or what would help to round out my collection of only 10 palettes. This one was a pretty easy pick. Okay, we're down to the last 2 to round out my 10 palette collection if I only had 10. Another more recent palette, another indie brand, and this one that I've really just become acquainted with, and that I've really fallen in love with. It's Gimme Glow, and it's the Vintage Rose palette. From the packaging to the palettes inside, the color story, just absolutely beautiful. You've seen me do 2 tutorials with this palette. I did a green look with it, and then I did a pink look with it. And this is why it made the list, because it has really all the pink and mauve tones, mauve berry tones that you really need in one palette, and certainly in your collection. It's got matte shades. It's got this beautiful pink shade that was amazing. That it showed up on my skin the way that it did was, again, blew me away. Anytime you can make a really bright eyeshadow that remains bright and shows up on my skin zone, I'm there for it. I'm all the way there for it. I'm gonna be singing your praises. Look at that pink. Like, oh, that's just amazing. The mattes are super soft, super pigmented, very easy to blend. I mean, these palettes are the easiest, I think, probably, aside from Pat McGrath. Well, even more so than Pat McGrath, because Pat McGrath's special shades, you know, require some work. But these, oh Lord, these metallic and matte shades really don't require any work. They are beautiful, very easy to work with. And yeah, so definitely this was an easy choice to round out my 10 palette collection if I only had 10. Last but not least, of course, my 10 eyeshadow palette collection, I don't even know if I could swatch anymore, would not be complete without at least one Pat McGrath palette, right? Yeah, duh. The one, and I had some on the list and I had to take them out, but the one that remained on the list was the Mothership 5 palette. I had quite a few of the mini palettes actually, but I ended up with just the one palette, and it's the Pat McGrath Mothership 5 palette. This is the Bronze Seduction palette, which might be surprising for some of you that of all the palettes that I own from her, the only one that would make the 10 palette eyeshadow list would be the most neutral one. And I think that's why it made the list, because these shadows here, these brown shades here, are really just nice for neutral looks. They're good for transition shades or crease shades, and you have the dark shadows, you have the special shadows. I mean, you know, I couldn't have an eyeshadow collection having had Pat McGrath and knowing what these special shades are like without having the special shades in the collection, in my collection. So these have the special shades and then this beautiful red. So you could really do every day with this. You could really do sexy smoky with this. I really thought about this palette and thinking about a special occasion, going out, date night, you know, makeup. What would be a palette that would be like a stunner palette, you know? And this is the palette that, of all of the ones that I have by her, this was the one that I felt like could do it all, basically. Could do more neutral, the shade right here. Woo-wee. You could do the more neutral every day, or you could really amp it up and do something really beautiful for evening or special occasions. So yeah, you know, once I thought about it, actually this palette was always on the list. So yeah, that is it. It was certainly more difficult choosing the palettes than it was talking about the palettes. But that is the list. Those are the 10 palettes. If I only had 10, these are the 10 that I would want. I feel like I'd have a well-rounded collection in blues, reds, neutrals, bright metallics, mattes. I really feel like this would round out my 10 palette collection. Let me know in the comments below, if you could only have 10 eyeshadow palettes, which palettes would they be? If you liked this video, then please give it a like and consider subscribing, because I do makeup related videos here on my channel every Saturday. I want to thank you for joining me today. I hope to see you again next week. Until then, bye-bye.